We begin in the deep silence of a Manhattan winter. It is the early hours of December 31st, 1945. Inside a fourth-floor apartment, the only sound is the rhythmic, metallic hiss of a cast-iron radiator fighting the chill of the drafty window. For 4 long years, this city has lived in the shadows of the dim-out, hiding its glow from the coast to protect against dangers unseen in the dark Atlantic. But tonight, the lights will finally return. This was not a night of raucous partying, but a collective, quiet exhale of a city surviving. Let us drift back to explore the sensory reality of the day peace finally settled over New York. As the grey light of dawn filters through frosted window panes, the city stirs, heavier than it has ever been. To understand the texture of this morning, we must first understand the sheer density of the space. New York in late 1945 was a city bursting at the seams, caught in the grip of the great housing shortage. The return of peace meant the return of people, hundreds of thousands of them, flooding back into a metropolis that had built almost nothing new since the Depression. It is important to remember that the city was not just crowded, it was compressed. If you were to walk through the lobbies of the great Midtown hotels on this grey morning, you would not see empty velvet chairs or open spaces. You would see luggage stacked like fortifications and weary veterans sleeping in rows on the carpet, waiting for a room that might not open for days. In the parks, temporary Quonset huts stood in rows, housing families who had nowhere else to go. But here, in the quiet interior of a Lower East Side tenement, the overcrowding is more intimate, more domestic. We find ourselves in a small parlor room, where the boundaries of privacy have been softened by necessity. A young man stirs on a sofa that is too short for his frame. He pulls a scratchy wool blanket up to his chin, seeking warmth against the morning draft. He has been home for 3 weeks, and this makeshift bed in his sister's apartment is the only space available. There is a profound stillness to his waking. For the first time in years, he is not waking to a bugle, or the roar of an engine, or the terrified anticipation of combat. He is waking to the domestic symphony of a building coming to life. Listen to the building. The steam pipes groan and clank. A metallic language of heat traveling through the walls to the floors above. The radiator whistles, a sharp, high note that signals the boiler in the basement is being fed. Through the thin plaster walls, the murmur of a neighbor's radio brings news of the weather. Cold, with a chance of snow. These are the sounds of safety. They are the mundane, repetitive noises of a world that is no longer at war. The air in the kitchen is thick with humidity and scent. A pot of coffee boils on the stove, strong, dark, and lightly stretched with a little chicory to make the ration stamps last longer. The smell of it mixes with the scent of damp wool drying on a line strung across the room, and the faint, lingering aroma of boiled cabbage from the hallway. It is a heavy, comforting atmosphere, smelling of lived-in spaces and warm fabric. The young man sits up, his feet finding the cold linoleum floor. He washes his face in a small basin, the water running cold before it finally turns hot. Every resource here feels precious. The bar of soap is worn thin, curved like a sliver of the moon. The towel is rough from years of line drying. In 1945, nothing was wasted. The war was over. But the habits of scarcity remained etched into the daily routine. He looks out the window at the fire escape, dusted with soot and snow. Below, the street is already moving. Milk trucks rattle over cobblestones, their glass bottles clinking in crates. The city is a machine that never truly stops. But on this particular morning, the gears grind with a specific purpose. Everyone is preparing, not for a riot, but for a witness. The day ahead is not just a page turning on a calendar. It is the closing of a chapter that had been written in fire and steel. Now, it is being written in steam, coffee, and the quiet resilience of millions of people simply trying to find their place in a world that has stopped burning. The morning has begun, and with it, the search for the ingredients of a celebration. To step out of the apartment and into the morning air was to enter an economy that operated by a set of rules entirely distinct from the free market we know today. While the fighting had ceased months earlier, the invisible architecture of the war still held the city in a tight, bureaucratic grip. This was the era of the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, a command economy that had turned every pantry in New York into a small branch of the federal government. Money, in the traditional sense, was only half the equation. You could have a pocket full of silver dollars and crisp bills, but without the right slip of paper, the butcher's case remained a locked vault. Let's consider the physical weight of this system. Before anyone left their home to gather the ingredients for a New Year's Eve dinner, they had to consult the most important document in the household, the war ration book. It was a fragile thing, printed on low-quality, fibrous paper that felt soft and worn under the thumb. By late 1945, these books were dog-eared, stained with the grease of 100 previous meals, and carried with a reverence usually reserved for religious texts or birth certificates. To lose a ration book was a domestic tragedy, a bureaucratic nightmare that could leave a family without sugar or meat for weeks. Inside the book lay the true currency of the city, the stamps. They were small, serrated squares, color-coded in red and blue, printed with tanks, ships, and torches. On this particular morning, the focus was on the red points. These were the keys to the kingdom of proteins and fats. The meat, the butter, the oils. As we stand in the line that spills out of the corner grocery store, we can see the ritual taking place. It is a slow, mathematical dance. The shoppers, mostly women in heavy wool coats, clutch their books, mentally calculating the cost of a celebration. Entering the grocer's shop, the air is thick with the scent of sawdust spread on the floor, the brine of pickle barrels, and the sharp, earthy smell of root vegetables. But the atmosphere is defined by what is missing. The shelves, usually a kaleidoscope of choices, are striped with gaps. The abundance of the pre-war years is still a distant memory. Canned fruits, imported spices, and prime cuts of beef are ghosts. In their place are the substitutes and the staples. We watch a customer approach the counter. She's hoping for a roast, something substantial to mark the turning of the year. The butcher, wiping his hands on a blood-stained apron, shakes his head slowly. The prime cuts have gone to the hotels or the returning troopships. But then, a quiet exchange occurs. A moment of negotiation that defined the era. He leans in, voice lowered, and suggests a cut that isn't on display. Perhaps kept cool in the icebox beneath the counter for loyal customers. She agrees, and then comes the payment. It is not a quick tap of a card or a simple exchange of cash. She opens the book. The butcher watches as she carefully tears out the required red point. The sound is distinct, the dry rip of the perforated paper. She hands them over like tokens of sacrifice. These stamps represent weeks of saving, of going without butter on toast, of drinking black coffee, all to save enough points for this single meal. The scarcity created a specific psychology around the New Year's table. The feast that would be eaten that night was not taken for granted. Every slice of meat, every spoonful of sugar in a cake was a victory of planning and patience. The empty spaces on the shelves were a visual reminder that the global supply chain was still broken, that ships were still moving troops rather than cargo. This was a paper economy, fragile and finite. As the woman leaves the store, clutching her brown paper parcel to her chest, she carries more than just dinner. She carries the tangible evidence of a world that is slowly, painfully, trying to balance its books. The transaction is done. The points are spent. And the focus now shifts from the acquisition of goods to the movement of the city itself. To move across the city on this day was to enter the subterranean arteries of the Interborough Rapid Transit, the IRT, or perhaps the BMT lines that stitch the boroughs together, leaving the biting cold of the street level. We descend the concrete stairs into the tiled cavern of the station. The air here holds a distinct, heavy quality that is entirely unlike the atmosphere of the modern subway. It is warmer, certainly, but it carries a complex chemical profile that has since vanished from the city's sensory landscape. The primary scent is ozone, that sharp, electric tang generated by the high-voltage sparks of the third rail. It mixes with the smell of wet wool, thousands of damp overcoats steaming slightly in the underground warmth, and the pervasive, lingering odor of stale tobacco. While smoking was technically prohibited inside the moving cars, the platforms often thickened with the haze of cigarettes lit by waiting passengers, and the smoke clung to every fabric, embedding itself into the wooden benches and the tiled walls. We stand on the platform, waiting. The silence of the tunnel is broken by a low rumble that grows into a roar. The train arrives not with a sleek, electronic hum, but with a heavy, mechanical violence. These are the low V cars, heavy steel boxes that seem to push the air before them. The doors slide open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing an interior that is a study in utilitarian durability. We step inside. The seating is not plastic, but woven rattan. Cane strips interlaced in a pattern that leaves a textured impression on the back of a coat. The floor is a composite material, worn smooth by millions of shoe soles. But the most striking feature of the ride is the light. There are no harsh fluorescent tubes here. Instead, the car is illuminated by a series of incandescent bulbs, glowing with a soft, warm yellow light. These bulbs were wired directly in series with the traction motors. This meant that every time the train passed over a gap in the third rail, or every time the motorman shifted the power, the lights would flicker and dim. It created a rhythmic, visual pulse to the journey. A moment of sudden twilight, followed by a surge of brightness, repeating over and over as the train hurtled through the dark. The soundscape is equally distinct. The windows are open a crack to let in air, allowing the deafening clatter of steel wheels on steel tracks to fill the car. It is a rhythmic clack, 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 clack that vibrates through the soles of your shoes. The passengers sway in unison with the lurching motion of the car. If you look down the row of rattan seats, you see a visual cross-section of 1945 America. There is a sea of uniforms. Even though the war is over, the city is still awash in military drab. You see the deep navy of sailors on shore leave, their white hats tipped back, and the olive wool of army soldiers, their duffel bags taking up precious floor space. But mixed in with them are the civilians, men in fedoras and double-breasted suits, women in sensible hats and fur-collared coats. There is a shared weariness on their faces. The unbridled euphoria of VJ Day in August has faded into the grind of reintegration. No one is shouting. No one is celebrating yet. They are simply commuters, enduring the ride. Above their heads, the subway sun placards offer a distraction. These iconic posters, framed in the curve of the ceiling, offer public service announcements and advertisements for products that are slowly returning to shelves. They urge patience with shortages and promote the purchase of victory bonds, the ink still bright on the cardboard. The train slows, the brakes squealing in a high-pitched protest, and the incandescent lights flicker once more before steadying. We have arrived in Midtown. The doors slide open, releasing the pressurized air and the crowd, pushing us out of the mechanical rhythm of the underground and toward the surface of the garment district. Emerging from the subterranean dimness of the subway station at 34th Street, we step directly into the chaotic, steaming heart of the city's economy, the garment district. It is important to remember that New York in 1945 was not just a center of finance or culture. It was the largest manufacturing city in the world, and this neighborhood was its engine room. Even on New Year's Eve, the district is alive with a frantic, rhythmic energy. The holiday has not yet begun for the thousands of workers here. The streets are a canyon of red brick and limestone, crowded not with tourists, but with the raw mechanics of production. The air here tastes different than it did in the subway. It is thick with the exhaust of delivery trucks idling at curbs and the pervasive, humid scent of steam. Looking up, you can see white plumes venting from the upper stories of the loft buildings, the exhaust from thousands of industrial steam presses hissing in unison. At street level, the sidewalks are an obstacle course. We navigate around the push boys, Young men maneuvering heavy iron racks of clothing on casters, shouting warnings as they barrel through the crowds. These racks are like mobile walls of fabric, fluttering in the cold wind, carrying tomorrow's fashions from the cutting rooms to the showrooms. But if you look closely at the garments swinging on those racks, you will see a profound shift in the visual language of the city. For 4 years, this district was conscripted. The sewing machines that lined these lofts had been tasked with stitching millions of olive drab uniforms, heavy canvas duffel bags, and nylon parachutes. The color palette of the garment district had been restricted to the muted tones of camouflage and utility. But today, as the racks roll by, we see flashes of something that feels almost scandalous in its brightness. Floral prints, deep reds, electric blues. The factories are retooling. The military contracts have been fulfilled, and the great pivot back to civilian life is happening one stitch at a time. Let us drift upward, riding a rattling freight elevator to the 8th floor of a loft on 7th Avenue. The doors open onto a vast, open floor plan, vibrating with the collective roar of 100 industrial Singer sewing machines. The noise is a physical weight, a relentless, rapid-fire percussion that drowns out conversation. The air is warm and hazy with fly, tiny microscopic fibers of cotton and wool that float in the shafts of winter sunlight, piercing the dirty windows. Here, we focus on a single seamstress near the window. She sits hunched over her machine, her posture shaped by years of piecework. Her hands move with a blurred, practiced efficiency, guiding fabric under the needle. For the last few years, the material under her fingers was coarse. Heavy wool serge for army jackets, rough denim for workwear. It was fabric designed to survive trenches and ship decks. But today, her hands are guiding something different. It is a bolt of rayon, smooth and cool to the touch, printed with a vibrant pattern of spring flowers. There is a quiet, tactile joy in this change. As she works, she is not just assembling a dress. She is constructing the aesthetic of peace. The silhouette she is sewing is changing too. The severe, boxy shoulders and fabric-conserving straight skirts of the war years, mandated by the War Production Board's L85 restrictions, are beginning to soften. There is a little more fabric in the skirt, a little more grace in the line. She runs her hand over the finished seam, smoothing the colourful cloth. It feels fragile compared to the uniforms, but it also feels like a promise. The clock on the wall ticks towards the midday break. The frantic pace begins to slow as the foremen shout the signal. The roar of the machines dies down, replaced by the sound of chairs scraping back, and the low murmur of voices switching between English, Italian, and Yiddish. The seamstress stands, brushing the colourful lint from her apron. She steps away from the machine, leaving the bright rayon draped over the work table, like a flag of the new era. It is time for the midday meal, time to descend from the humid loft back to the cold street, and to join the thousands of others streaming towards that great democratic institution of the New York lunch, the automat. To understand the rhythm of a New York lunch hour in 1945, one must step through the revolving doors of the horn and hard art automat, It was more than a restaurant. It was a culinary machine, a gleaming cathedral of chrome and glass that served the city with the same relentless efficiency as the factories served the war effort. Stepping inside from the grey street, the first sensation is not hunger, but a dazzling visual contrast. The interior is vast and gilded, with high ceilings, Art Deco mirrors, and marble columns. It looks like a grand opera house, yet it smells of baked beans, damp wool, and Salisbury steak. The soundscape here is entirely unique to the era. It is a symphony of small metallic percussions. Before anyone eats, they must visit the nickel thrower. In a glass booth near the entrance, a woman with rubber tips on her fingers sits behind a marble counter. You slide a dollar bill toward her, and in a blur of motion, she skims 20 nickels back across the smooth stone. They arrive in a perfect stack, cool and heavy in the palm. These coins are the keys to the room. We walk towards the famous wall of windows. It is a grid of hundreds of small glass-fronted compartments, rows upon rows of steel-framed boxes. Inside each one, bathed in the glow of a dedicated light bulb, sits a single plate of food, a slice of cherry pie, a bowl of macaroni and cheese, a plate of creamed spinach. It is a museum of comfort food, displayed like jewelry. The ritual of retrieval is tactile and precise. You stand before the window of your choice. You insert the required number of nickels into the slot, usually 2 or 3. Clink, clink. Then you turn the porcelain knob. There is a distinct mechanical click as the lock disengages, followed by the soft whir of the glass door swinging upward. You reach into the warm compartment and pull out the heavy ceramic plate. The door snaps shut behind you, and almost instantly, a pair of hands appears from the darkness behind the wall to replace the empty space with a fresh plate. It is a magic trick of logistics, a seamless loop of supply and demand. But the centerpiece of the automat experience is the coffee. We approach the dolphin-headed spouts that jut from the marble wall. For a single nickel, you turn the handle, and a precise measure of hot, strong coffee streams into your cup. This was the fuel of the city. The cup itself is thick-walled and heavy, designed to survive the dishwasher and the clumsy hands of 1,000,000 diners. Carrying the tray to a table, we find the social heart of the room. The tables are long slabs of marble or heavy wood, and the seating is communal. There are no reservations here, and no waiters to tip. It is a profoundly democratic space. A banker in a silk tie sits next to a stevedore in a wool cap. A secretary sits across from a musician. In the crowded chaos of midday, social barriers dissolve over plates of 5-cent beans. Yet, within this crowd, there is a profound sense of solitude. We focus on a man sitting at the end of a long table. He has cleared a small space amidst the debris of lunch to spread out a newspaper. He is eating mechanically, his eyes scanning the columns of text, completely isolated in a room of 500 people. The clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation wash over him like the tide. But he is in his own world. He scrapes the last of the gravy from his plate with a roll, wipes his mouth with a paper napkin, and checks his watch. The respite is over. He stands, leaving the heavy dishes for the busboys, who move like shadows through the room. He buttons his coat, preparing to trade the warmth of the gilded hall for the biting wind of the corner, where the news of the world awaits in black and white. Stepping out of the revolving doors and back into the biting wind of the avenue, we encounter the nerve center of the city's consciousness. In 1945, there were no scrolling feeds, no vibrating notifications in pockets, and no 24-hour cable cycles. There was only the newsstand, standing on the corner like a small wooden fortress against the cold. It was the physical internet of the era, a chaotic, colorful kiosk that dispensed the world in black and white. As we approach, the first thing that hits us is the smell. It is a distinct, aggressive scent. A mixture of fresh, damp pine pulp, the chemical tang of cheap ink, and the metallic odor of copper pennies. On a damp winter day like this one, the paper absorbs the moisture in the air, intensifying the smell until it becomes the defining perfume of the street corner. The stand itself is a marvel of compression, a dense collage of information stacked from the pavement to the corrugated tin roof. We step closer, huddled against the structure to escape the wind. The headlines on this particular afternoon tell the story of a city in limbo. The bold block letters of the New York Times and the Daily News scream out the transition of power. This is the final day of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia's administration. The little flower, the man who had read the comics to children over the radio during newspaper strikes and guided the city through the Depression and the war, is packing his bags. Tomorrow, William O'Dwyer takes the helm. The headlines are not jubilant. They are reflective, marking the end of a charismatic, chaotic era of municipal governance. Scanning the other papers, the Herald Tribune, the Mirror, the Journal American, we see the anxieties of the peace laid bare. The war maps, with their arrows and front lines that had dominated the front pages for 4 years, are gone. In their place are stories of labor unrest. The headlines speak of the United Auto Workers strikes, of picket lines, and of the paralyzing fear of inflation. There is also the looming shadow of the housing crisis, with stories detailing the plight of veterans sleeping in gymnasiums. The news is no longer about defeating a foreign enemy. It is about the messy, complex business of living together again. But the newsstand is not just about the heavy reality of the broadsheets. To the side, hanging from wire clips or stacked in glossy piles, are the magazines, the technicolor dreams of the American century. The covers of Life, Time, and the Saturday Evening Post offer a vivid counterpoint to the grey newsprint. Here, on the glossy pages, the post-war dream is being constructed in real time. We see covers featuring illustrations of the home of tomorrow. Sleek suburban houses with 2-car garages and electric kitchens. We see advertisements for products that are finally returning to the consumer market. Nylon stockings, rubber tires, and shiny new toasters. The artwork is lush and optimistic, painting a future of abundance that stands in contrast to the rationing reality of the current moment. These magazines were not just reading material. They were catalogues of hope, promised rewards for the years of sacrifice. The vendor himself is a fixture of the landscape, wrapped in layers of wool and fingerless gloves. He moves with a rhythmic efficiency, snatching a paper from the stack, folding it, and exchanging it for a coin in a single fluid motion. He is the curator of the city's information, barking out the names of the late editions, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The sound of his voice, rough and repetitive, is part of the street's music, a human algorithm sorting the flow of news. We hand over a nickel, the coin cold against our skin. In return, we receive the late city edition. It has a physical weight to it, a heft that digital media can never replicate. The ink is fresh enough that it smudges slightly on our gloves, leaving a grey stain of information on our fingertips. We tuck the paper under our arm, pressing it against our side to keep it from flapping in the wind. It is a shield and a map, a guide to the world as it stands on the precipice of 1946. Clutching this bundle of wood pulp and ink, we turn away from the shelter of the stand. The wind catches us again, pushing us down the avenue. We have fed the body at the automat and the mind at the newsstand. Now it is time to join the flow of humanity moving towards the great transit hubs, where the true scale of the post-war migration can be felt. The day is darkening, and the city's pulse is quickening as the commuter rush begins to merge with the holiday anticipation. To understand the emotional gravity of this particular New Year's Eve, we must leave the cold wind of the street and enter the vast, echoing cathedral of Pennsylvania Station. We are not speaking of the subterranean maze that sits beneath Madison Square Garden today. We are speaking of the original structure, the Beaux-Arts masterpiece of pink granite and travertine that occupied 2 full city blocks. In 1945, this station was more than a transit hub. It was the primary gateway between the war and the peace. It was the funnel through which the United States Army was being poured back into civilian life. Passing through the massive Doric columns of the 7th Avenue entrance, we step into the main waiting room. The scale of the space is difficult to comprehend. A room modelled after the baths of Caracalla in Rome, with a ceiling soaring 150 feet above the floor. On this afternoon, the vast sun-drenched hall is not empty. It is a sea of olive drab and navy blue. The floor is carpeted with thousands of servicemen, some standing in tight knots of conversation, others sleeping on their canvas duffel bags, waiting for the next train, west or south. This was the height of Operation Magic Carpet, the massive logistical effort to repatriate millions of Americans from Europe and the Pacific. Every day, trains arrived carrying thousands of GIs who had just disembarked from troop ships in the harbour. The air in the station is thick with a specific, heavy atmosphere. It smells of the coal smoke drifting up from the track levels below, mixing with the scent of cheap tobacco, floor wax, and the damp wool of 10,000 uniforms. The soundscape is a constant, reverberating wash of noise. The high vaulted ceiling catches every footstep and amplifies it. We hear the sharp clack, clack, clack of leather combat boots on the marble floor. A sound distinct from the softer tread of civilian shoes. Above the murmur of the crowd, the public address system booms with a rhythmic, nasal cadence, announcing track numbers and destinations. Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, St. Louis. Each city name spoken is a promise of home. We focus our attention on a single soldier standing near the information booth. He is young, perhaps 22, but his face holds the specific, aged exhaustion of the infantry. He leans against a travertine pillar, one foot resting on his kit bag. If you look closely at his uniform, above the right breast pocket, you will see a small, diamond-shaped patch of gold cloth embroidered with an eagle inside a wreath. This is the Honorable Service lapel button, known affectionately and cynically by the troops as the ruptured duck. It signifies that he is being discharged. He is wearing the uniform only because he has no civilian clothes yet, a common reality in the textile-starved economy of 1945. He checks his watch, a sturdy, scratched field piece on a canvas strap. He is waiting. There is a tension in his posture that has nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the terrifying unfamiliarity of peace. He scans the faces in the crowd, wives, mothers, and fathers who have come to the city to meet the trains. The reunions here are not always the cinematic, running embraces of the newsreels. Often they are quieter, more hesitant. We watch as a woman in a grey coat spots him. She stops, her hand going to her mouth. He straightens up, dropping his cigarette to the stone floor and crushing it with his heel. They move toward each other slowly, as if the space between them is fragile. When they finally embrace, it is a desperate, crushing hold. A silent collapsing of the distance that had separated them for years. Around them, the stream of commuters flows on, respectful of the moment but accustomed to it. Yet for every reunion, there is a shadow. The station is also filled with those who are just watching, or those whose soldiers did not return. The joy of the arrival is tempered by the heavy, palpable absence of the fallen. The grandeur of the architecture, with its soaring windows and classical statues, lends a solemnity to the scene. It feels less like a train station and more like a temple of transition. As the afternoon wears on, the light filtering through the high thermal windows begins to fade, turning from dusty gold to a deep, bruised purple. The soldier picks up his bag, slinging the heavy canvas over his shoulder. He takes the woman's arm, and together they turn toward the exit. They are leaving the station, leaving the army, and stepping out into the darkening city. The sun has set on the last day of the war years. Outside, the streetlights are preparing to do something they haven't done in a very long time. As the soldier and his companion step onto 7th Avenue, the sun has vanished behind the New Jersey Palisades, leaving the city suspended in the blue hour of twilight. It is here, in this transitional moment, that the most profound change of the night begins to manifest. To understand the sheer visual shock of New Year's Eve, 1945, one must first understand the darkness that had defined the previous 4 years. Since the chaotic spring of 1942, New York had lived under the strict enforcement of the dim out, and later the slightly less severe brownout. This was not the total, crushing darkness of London during the Blitz, but a regulated gloom that had fundamentally altered the character of the metropolis. The Great White Way had been extinguished. The massive, kinetic electric signs that defined Times Square had been turned off to save fuel and reduce the city's sky glow. The fear was real and tactical. The radiant aura of Manhattan, visible for miles at sea, could silhouette Allied merchant ships against the horizon, turning them into perfect black targets for the German U-boats that hunted along the Atlantic coast. To combat this, the city had been hooded. Streetlights were painted black on their upper halves, directing a weak, anemic puddle of light solely onto the pavement while leaving the architecture in shadow. Shop windows were draped in heavy blackout curtains, or simply left dark. For years, the night had been a space of caution, a time to hurry home before the visibility dropped to zero. But tonight, the paint has been scraped away. The curtains have been pulled down. As the electrical grid surges to meet the demand of the winter evening, the city does not fade into the grey obscurity to which its citizens had grown accustomed. Instead, it erupts. It begins with the street lamps. The sodium vapor and incandescent bulbs, now fully exposed, cast a net of brilliance that reaches up the facades of the skyscrapers. The light hits the dirty snow piled in the gutters, making it sparkle like crushed diamonds. Then, the storefronts join the chorus. The windows of Macy's, Saks, and the thousands of smaller shops along the avenues suddenly flood the sidewalks with artificial daylight. For a child of 6 living in the city, this might be the first time they have ever seen the streets truly lit at night. For the adults, the sensation is physical, almost blinding. People stop in their tracks. This is not a figure of speech. The flow of pedestrian traffic actually halts as commuters pause to look up. The light is disorienting in its intensity. It reveals the weariness of the city, the soot-stained limestone, the cracked pavement, the peeling paint, but it also reveals the faces of the crowd. In the dim out, every passing stranger was a silhouette, a shadow to be navigated with suspicion. Now, in the wash of electric light, they are neighbors again. You can see the color of a coat, the expression of a tired worker, the steam rising from a grate. The psychological weight of the wall, which thrived in the shadows, is burned away by the sheer wattage of the display. The visual silence has been broken. The jewelry stores on Fifth Avenue sparkle with a defiant brilliance, the light refracting through the plate glass and dancing on the wet asphalt. The street itself becomes a mirror, doubling the illumination, turning the avenues into rivers of liquid gold and neon red. This unmasking is the true signal that the emergency has passed. The city is no longer hiding. It is no longer afraid to be seen from the sea or the sky. The artificial horizon of Manhattan is reasserting itself against the night. But while the public streets are becoming a carnival of electricity, a softer, more intimate light is being kindled in the apartments above. We turn our gaze from the blinding avenues to the warm, yellow glow of a window in Greenwich Village, where the domestic front is preparing its own quiet celebration. Leaving the electric spectacle of the avenues, we retreat into the winding, narrower streets of Greenwich Village. Here, away from the commercial glare, the city feels more intimate, a collection of small villages rather than a monolith of stone. We find ourselves climbing the worn stairs of a brownstone walk-up, the air in the hallway smelling of floor wax, and the collective dinners of 6 families. Entering a third-floor apartment, the roar of the metropolis fades into a muffled hum. It is here, in the quiet privacy of the domestic sphere, that the true texture of the evening is revealed. The kitchen is small, painted in a pale, sterile yellow, and it is warm. The oven has been on for hours, fighting a valiant battle against the draft that seeps through the sash windows. On the counter, the preparations for the New Year's feast are underway, but they are a study in ingenuity rather than excess. The hostess stands at the table, engaged in a ritual that was universal in American kitchens of the era: the coloring of the margarine. Butter was still a ghost, a rarity that vanished from shelves as quickly as it arrived. In its place was oleomargarine, a white vegetable fat substance that looked unappealingly like lard. To make it palatable for a festive table, it had to be transformed. We watch as she works the white block in a mixing bowl, breaking a small capsule of yellow food coloring into the mass. With a wooden spoon, she streaks the dye through the fat, folding and pressing, until the stark white turns into a cheerful, artificial buttercup yellow. It is a tedious, muscular chore, a small act of culinary alchemy to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The main course in the oven is likely a pork roast. Beef was still elusive, and it is being stretched. Potatoes, onions, and carrots crowd the roasting pan, absorbing the precious drippings. There's no waste here. The sensory profile of the room is dominated by this savory warmth, a heavy, comforting blanket of scent that signifies safety. In the living room, the primary source of entertainment glows with a soft, amber light. The radio console, a substantial piece of mahogany furniture, is the hearth of the home. The vacuum tubes inside have warmed up, emitting a faint, ozone-like smell of hot dust and electricity. From the fabric-covered speaker comes the voice of the world. It is not yet time for the raucous countdowns. Instead, the dial is tuned to a big band broadcast, perhaps the smooth, cascading sounds of Guy Lombardo's Royal Canadians, playing the sweetest music this side of heaven. The music is lush and sentimental, filling the spaces between the conversation. At the small dining table, pushed against the wall to save space, a couple sits down to eat. The scene is poignant in its quietness. The husband has been back from the Pacific for only a month. He is still wearing his service-issue undershirt beneath a civilian cardigan that feels loose on his frame. They are using the good china, plates that have sat dusty in a cabinet for the duration of the war. There is a profound intimacy to this meal that transcends the food. For years, their relationship was conducted through V-mail letters, heavily censored and delayed by weeks. Now they are relearning the rhythm of each other's presence. The clink of silverware against porcelain is loud in the small room. They do not speak much. The radio fills the silence comfortably. They are simply existing in the same space, sharing a meal that required no ration points for the vegetables, enjoying the novelty of a night where he does not have to leave, and she does not have to worry. Outside, the wind rattles the pane, a reminder of the cold winter night waiting beyond the brick walls. But inside, the apartment is a capsule of peace. They finish the roast, wiping the plates clean. The night is young, and the pull of the city is strong. The radio announcer mentions the crowds building in Times Square, the gathering energy of the vigil. They exchange a look, a silent agreement to leave the warm cocoon. They rise, clearing the table together, a new team in a new era. It is time to put on the heavy coats, to turn off the radio, and to step out of the private sanctuary and into the public current that is flowing relentlessly towards the center of the world. To step onto the sidewalk on this night was to surrender individual will to the collective momentum of the city, from the narrow side streets of the village, from the dark canyons of the financial district, and from the residential blocks of the Upper West Side. The population of New York was draining into the avenues, drawn by an invisible gravity toward the intersection of 42nd Street and Broadway. This was not a chaotic scramble. It was a migration, slow, steady, and seemingly inevitable. As the hour grew later, the distinct neighborhoods of Manhattan began to bleed into one another, their boundaries erased by the sheer volume of humanity, moving north and south, all seeking the center. The soundscape of this movement was unique to the era. If you were to close your eyes and listen to a modern crowd of this size, you would hear a chaotic, high-frequency layer of electronic noise. The ring of phones, the shout of people fighting to be heard over amplified music, the harsh blare of car horns. But on New Year's Eve, 1945, the acoustic profile of the street was lower, heavier, and strangely muffled. It was the sound of leather soles on pavement, a rhythmic, shuffling percussion of hundreds of thousands of feet. It was the low-frequency hum of conversation, a murmur that rose from the street level like steam. The crowd was not shouting, it was talking. They were sharing the news of the day, the plans for tomorrow, the relief of the year ending. The winter itself played a role in dampening the noise. The air was biting cold, and the city had dressed for it. This was a sea of heavy natural fibers, thick wool overcoats, fur collars, felt fedoras, and heavy gabardine. This density of fabric acted as a massive acoustic absorber, soaking up the sharp edges of the city's noise. When bodies pressed together in the crush of the intersection, it was a silent friction. The rough texture of a surplus pea coat brushing against the smooth weave of a civilian trench coat. It was in this crush that the true democracy of the evening revealed itself. The war had scrambled the social hierarchy of the city, and the peace had not yet sorted it back out. In the slow-moving river of people flowing down 7th Avenue, the distinctions of class and rank were compressed into irrelevance. You might see a Navy commander, gold braid on his sleeves, squeezed shoulder to shoulder with a transit worker in a heavy canvas jacket. A group of secretaries from a midtown typing pool, their arms linked to keep from being separated, might find themselves marching in step with a welder from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. There was no VIP section here, no rope lines. The street belonged to everyone equally, and the shared experience of the last 4 years created a permissive, patient atmosphere. There was very little pushing. There was a sense that everyone was heading to the same destination, both geographically and historically. Controlling this massive flow was the NYPD, but their presence on this night felt less like a force of order and more like a shepherding influence. The most distinct sensory detail of their presence was the mounted unit. Above the heads of the crowd, you could see the breath of the police horses pluming in the cold air. The animals stood like islands in the stream, their dark coats steaming. The sound of their iron-shod hooves clattering on the asphalt cut through the murmur of the crowd, a sharp, organic note in the mechanical city. The officers sat high in their saddles, their long coats draped over the horses' flanks, gesturing with gloved hands, guiding the tributaries of people away from the dangerous bottlenecks and into the open expanse of the square. Their tone was one of supervision rather than suppression. They were not there to stop the celebration. They were there to witness it, just like everyone else. As the crowd thickened, moving past the darkened storefronts of the lower 40s, the physical temperature began to rise. The collective body heat of the gathering mass fought against the winter chill. You could feel the warmth radiating from the person next to you, a shared thermal reality that made the cold bearable. The smell of the crowd was the smell of the city in winter. Damp wool, the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco, the exhaust of the buses inching along the periphery, and the crisp, clean scent of snow that was beginning to threaten from the low-hanging clouds. The anticipation was building, but it was a patient, grounded excitement. This was not a crowd desperate for distraction. It was a crowd looking for confirmation. They were moving toward the light, toward the place where the pulse of the city was strongest. Every step brought them closer to the canyon of Broadway, where the darkness of the war years was about to be officially, electrically banished. The murmur grew slightly louder, the pace slightly quicker, as the buildings fell away to reveal the open sky of the crossroads. As the crowd spills into the open expanse where Broadway slices across 7th Avenue, the sensory experience shifts from the auditory to the overwhelmingly visual. We have arrived at the Canyon of Light. For a modern observer, accustomed to the high-definition glare of LED screens that turn night into a seamless digital day, the Times Square of 1945 might seem primitive. But to the eyes of those stepping out of the shadows of the war years, it was a blinding, incandescent miracle. This was not the cool, flat light of pixels. It was the hot, buzzing, physical light of neon and tungsten. It was a light you could almost hear, a light that generated heat, a light that felt alive. Dominating the visual landscape was a masterpiece of mechanical advertising that had become a city landmark, the Camel cigarette sign. Mounted high on the side of the Hotel Claridge, it was more than a billboard. It was a piece of theatre. We look up to see the giant, painted face of a soldier, his expression relaxed, a cigarette poised in his hand. But the wonder lay in the mechanics. Behind the steel facade, a complex system of steam pipes and bellows worked in a rhythmic cycle. Every few seconds, a puff of white steam was forced through a hole in the painting's mouth. It drifted out into the cold night air, expanding and dissolving like a perfect smoke ring. It was a hypnotic loop, a breathing giant watching over the crowd, exhaling the relief of the city. Across the square, another colossus competed for attention. The Bond clothes waterfall. This was a spectacle of sheer excess that seemed impossible after years of conservation. High above the street, a massive, illuminated cascade of real water tumbled down the face of the building. We are talking about 50,000 gallons of recirculated water, shimmering under the glare of hidden spotlights. In the freezing air of December, the mist from the falls drifted down to the street, mingling with the steam from the manholes. To see such a lavish expenditure of energy and resources, water flowing for no purpose other than beauty, light burning for no purpose other than spectacle, was a visceral signal that the era of scarcity was ending. The light itself had a specific texture. This was the golden age of neon. The signs were hand-bent glass tubes filled with noble gases, glowing with a spectral purity that LEDs cannot replicate. There was the deep, vibrating red of pure neon, the electric blue of argon, and the golden white of helium. These were not flat colors. They were luminous ribbons of gas suspended in a vacuum, buzzing with high voltage. The air around the signs seemed to vibrate with the electrical load. Consider the invisible infrastructure supporting this display. Miles beneath the feet of the revelers, the turbines of the consolidated Edison power plant were spinning at maximum capacity. Coal was being shoveled into furnaces at a frantic pace to generate the massive amperage required to keep the Great White Way white. The grid was surging, pushing electricity through copper veins to ignite the filaments of millions of incandescent bulbs that studded the marquees like diamonds. On the ground, the effect was kaleidoscopic. The pavement, wet with melted snow and trampled slush, acted as a dark mirror. The reds, blues, and yellows from above were reflected in the black asphalt, turning the street into a river of liquid light. For the people standing in it, the sensation was one of total immersion. They were bathed in the glow, their faces tinted by the shifting colors of the advertisements. After 4 years of navigating a city of shadows, where a lit match could be a crime, this unchecked, riotous explosion of lumens was a shock to the system. It was a visual feast for a starving city, a declaration written in glass and electricity that the darkness had finally, truly lifted. It is important to understand that the atmosphere in Times Square on this specific night was not one of raucous abandon. If you were to look at the newsreels from August, the VJ Day celebrations, you would see a riot of uncontained joy, a release of tension that bordered on hysteria. But New Year's Eve was different. As the minute hand of the clock on the Paramount building crept towards the top of the hour, the mood settled into something that felt less like a carnival and more like a massive open-air vigil. The sound of the crowd was the most telling detail. There were hundreds of thousands of people packed into the Bowtie intersection, where Broadway slices across 7th Avenue. Yet there was no roar. Instead, there was a deep, resonant hum. It was the sound of a city talking to itself in low tones. People were not shouting to be heard over amplified music. They were leaning in, speaking into the collars of heavy wool coats. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with memory. The tin trumpets and wooden ratchets that were sold on the corners remained largely in pockets, waiting for the signal. We must remember that for nearly everyone standing in that cold slush, the year 1945 was not just a historical marker, it was a scar. There was hardly a family in the crowd that had not been touched by the telegrams of the War Department. The man standing next to you might have lost a brother in the Ardennes only 10 months prior. The woman clutching her purse might be a Gold Star mother, her grief still raw. The celebration was tempered by the presence of ghosts. The empty chairs at the holiday tables were a fresh reality. This gathering was not just to welcome the new year. It was to witness the final burial of the old one, a year that had consumed so much life. There was also a new, quieter anxiety threading through the crowd, one that had not existed in previous years. The end of the war had come with a flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world had changed fundamentally. The joyous certainty of victory was mixed with the complex, terrifying realization of the atomic age. The people standing in the neon glow understood, perhaps only subconsciously, that the peace they had won was fragile. They were standing on the threshold of an era that no one could predict. This uncertainty kept the voices low and the mood reflective. Physically, the weight was an endurance test against the elements. The cold was seeping through the soles of leather shoes, numbing toes. To keep the circulation moving, the crowd developed a collective, rhythmic motion, the stamping of feet. If you listened closely beneath the hum of voices, you could hear it. A dull, thumping percussion of thousands of shoes striking the pavement. A heartbeat rising from the ground. The air above the crowd was thick with a low-hanging fog, created not by the weather, but by the condensation of 200,000 breaths, exhaling into the freezing air. In this compression of bodies, strange and gentle intimacies formed. A match struck for a cigarette would be shielded by the cupped hands of 3 strangers. A flask of whiskey, hidden in a coat pocket, might be passed silently between 2 men who had never met. A shared communion against the cold. There was a politeness to the interactions that seems foreign to the modern experience of such a crush. They were united not just by the location, but by the survival of the ordeal. They were the ones who made it through. As the final minutes ticked away, the hum of conversation began to drop even lower, fading into a hush of anticipation. Faces turned upward, bathed in the artificial daylight. Eyes locking onto the flagpole atop the Times Tower. The wait was almost over. High above the intersection, where the wind whips around the stone cornice of the Times Tower, the focus of 500,000 eyes narrows to a single, suspended object. It is important to remember that the technology of celebration in 1945 was mechanical, heavy, and analog. The famous sphere waiting at the top of the flagpole was not a geodesic crystal marvel controlled by a computer. It was a utilitarian structure, a 5-foot skeleton of iron straps weighing 700 pounds, covered in wood and canvas. It did not shimmer with internal LEDs. It was a dark silhouette against the night sky, waiting to catch the floodlights from below. The mechanism of its descent was equally manual. 6 electricians stood on the roof, their gloved hands gripping a 5/8-inch manila rope. They were the clockwork of the city. As the final seconds of the year drained away, they did not watch a digital readout. They watched a stopwatch and the hand signals of a foreman. The descent of the ball was a physical labor, a hand-over-hand release of tension that mirrored the release of the crowd below. As the ball begins its slow slide down the pole, the soundscape of the square undergoes a profound shift. The low, murmuring hum of the vigil fractures. It begins as a ripple of recognition near the base of the tower and spreads outward like a wave moving through water. It is not the synchronized, chanted countdown of the modern era. In 1945, the crowd did not shout the numbers in unison. Instead, there was a rising, chaotic swell of noise, a crescendo of realization that the moment was arriving. When the iron sphere finally thuds into its cradle at the base of the pole, the circuit is completed. The numerals 1946 on the parapet of the Paramount building blaze into existence, burning white against the dark sky. And then, the sound arrives. It is a deafening, physical roar, but its texture is distinct to the mid-century. It lacks the electronic distortion of amplified speakers. This is an acoustic wall of sound, composed of human voices and mechanical devices. Thousands of wooden ratchets, the noisemakers of the era, clack furiously, a sound like a plague of locusts. Tin trumpets, stamped from cheap sheet metal, bleat into the cold air. Cowbells, whistles, and car horns join the chorus. It is a harsh, metallic, and overwhelmingly organic din that vibrates in the chest of every person standing in the slush. But beneath the noise, the emotional frequency is different from any other year. The cheer that rises from Broadway is not merely jubilant, it is laden with a profound, exhausting relief. This is the sound of a city exhaling after holding its breath for 4 years. The war is over. The killing has stopped. The lights are on. The sheer survival of the civilization is what is being celebrated. The joy is fierce, but it is the fierce joy of the survivor, heavy with the knowledge of how close the darkness had come. In the crush of the crowd, we focus on a single couple near the subway entrance. The man, wearing a navy peacoat, turns to the woman beside him. He does not swing her back in a cinematic dip. He simply pulls her close, burying his face in the collar of her coat. Their kiss is desperate, a reclaiming of time lost, a physical confirmation that they are both here, alive, in this lit-up world. It is an echo of the famous VJ Day embrace, but quieter, more private, grounded in the reality of the long road ahead. As the initial roar begins to subside, a melody emerges from the chaos. It starts in pockets. A group of sailors here, a family there, and knits together until the entire canyon of light is singing. Old Lang Syne drifts up toward the skyscrapers. The lyrics, asking if old acquaintances should be forgotten, carry a devastating weight on this particular night. Everyone singing has an acquaintance, a brother, or a son who is not there to sing it. The song becomes a collective elegy, a final nod to the ghosts of the war before the city turns its face, finally and fully, towards the peace of 1946. The dispersal of a crowd of 500,000 people is not a sudden event. It is a slow, hydraulic process, a receding tide of humanity that leaves the architecture of the city exposed once more. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the great density of the vigil has fractured. The collective heat generated by the mass of bodies dissipates, rising into the night sky. And in its place, the biting winter wind returns to reclaim the avenues. It whistles through the concrete canyons of Midtown, no longer blocked by the wall of wool coats, cutting across the intersections with a sharp, lonely sound that emphasizes the sudden emptiness of the space. As the people retreat into the subway entrances or scatter down the side streets toward the ferry terminals, they leave behind a physical record of the celebration. The pavement of Times Square is no longer black asphalt. It has been transformed into a textured, grey mosaic. This is the snow of the paper economy. In a city that had just spent years recycling every scrap of material for the war effort, the sheer volume of confetti on the ground is shocking. It is a slush of shredded telephone books, ticker tape, torn newspapers and streamers, all matted down by the wet soles of thousands of shoes. Under the harsh glare of the streetlights, which continue to burn with their newfound brilliance, this carpet of debris looks almost geological. The neon signs, still flashing their commercial messages to a rapidly emptying room, reflect off the wet, paper-slicked streets in distorted ripples of red and gold. The traffic lights cycle rhythmically from green to red and back to green, directing phantom traffic that has not yet returned. There is a profound melancholy in this visual, the aftermath of a party that the entire world had been waiting for, now reduced to damp pulp in the gutter. In this landscape of discarded joy, we find a solitary figure who represents the return of the city's routine. He is a sanitation worker, clad in a heavy canvas uniform, pushing a wide, stiff, bristled broom. The sound of his work is distinct and rhythmic. Swish, scrape, swish, scrape, echoing off the facades of the theatres. He's moving mountains of wet paper, pushing the debris of history toward the sewer grate. He works methodically, his breath pluming in the cold air, a singular point of focus in the cavernous street. He does not stop to read the headlines on the trampled newspapers. He simply clears the path for the morning, erasing the evidence of the night before the sun has a chance to rise. Below the street, the atmosphere is equally subdued. The subway cars that rumble toward Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens are no longer the tense, crowded vessels of the early evening. Now, they are nurseries for the exhausted. The incandescent bulbs flicker with the movement of the train, casting long, swaying shadows over the passengers. Almost everyone is seated. The adrenaline of the midnight hour has crashed, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that seems to seep into the rattan seats. We see a row of passengers swaying in unison as the train navigates a curve. A man in a fedora has fallen asleep with his head tipped back against the window, his mouth slightly open, his hat threatening to slide onto the floor. A couple sits with their shoulders touching, their eyes closed, holding hands loosely in the space between them. The air in the car is thick with the smell of wet wool drying in the heat, mixed with the faint, lingering scent of cheap champagne and stale tobacco. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels is no longer an urgent tempo. It has become a lullaby, a mechanical heartbeat carrying the city to bed. When these travelers finally emerge from the stations into their quiet neighborhoods, the silence is absolute. The wind in the trees of a Brooklyn street or the distant hoot of a tugboat on the Hudson are the only sounds. The key turns in the lock. A small metallic scratch in the stillness. The heavy coats are hung up. The shoes are kicked off. And the lights in the apartments are extinguished one by one. The city, which had pulsed with such frantic energy only hours before, settles into a rare and heavy slumber. It is a sleep earned by survival, a deep, restorative unconsciousness that blankets the 5 boroughs. The streets are empty, save for the wind and the ghosts of the war, as the darkness stretches out toward the first dawn of the new era. The first light of 1946 does not arrive with a fanfare. It creeps slowly over the low horizon of Long Island, filtering through the winter haze that hangs over the East River. It is a pale, watery gold, a shy illumination that begins to touch the tops of the water towers and the spires of the Midtown cathedrals. As the sun climbs higher, it strikes the limestone facades of the skyscrapers, turning the grey stone into a brilliant, warming amber. The city, which had been an island of artificial electric fire only hours before, is now reclaimed by the natural rhythm of the morning. The streets below are profoundly, almost reverently, quiet. The roar of the vigil has vanished completely. The wind that whistled through the canyons during the night has died down, leaving the air still and crisp. The only evidence of the massive event that took place is the confetti, now frozen into the slush of the gutters, a colourful sedimentary layer marking the end of the war years. But unlike the dark, exhausted emptiness of the night, this morning silence feels expectant. It is the silence of a clean slate. In this stillness, the specific acoustic details of the new year begin to emerge. We hear the low, mechanical grumble of a Divco milk truck turning the corner onto a residential street in Brooklyn. This vehicle, with its rounded nose and sliding doors, is the herald of the morning routine. The driver, dressed in white, steps out into the cold. He does not rush. There is no urgency in his movements, for the emergency is over. We hear the distinct, musical clink of glass bottles rattling in a wire carrier. He walks up the stoop of a brownstone, his boots crunching softly on the frost. He exchanges the empty bottles left on the mat for full ones. The cream separated at the top, capped with foil. It is a small domestic ritual, a return to the gentle logistics of peace. Inside the apartments, the city is still sleeping. The soldiers on the couches, the couples in the bedrooms, the children who stayed up too late. They're all suspended in a deep, restorative unconsciousness. They do not know it yet, but they are waking up to a world that will be fundamentally different from the one they fell asleep in. The blueprints for the next 50 years are already waiting in the silence. The suburbs that will sprawl across the potato fields of Long Island. The baby boom that will rewrite the demographics of the nation. The cold geopolitical winter that will replace the hot war. All of these are gathering on the horizon, but on this specific morning, they are just ghosts of the future. For now, there is only the peace. It is a tangible weight in the air, a lack of tension that the city hasn't felt since the late 30s. There are no air raid sirens testing their wail. There are no blackouts to plan for. The newspapers hitting the doorsteps, thrown with a heavy thwack by boys in wool caps, carry headlines of strikes and politics. But they do not carry the names of battles. The maps have stopped changing. The borders are settling. As the sun fully breaches the skyline, flooding the avenues with a hard, bright winter light, a single church bell begins to toll in the distance. It is joined by another, and then another, ringing out not in alarm, but in marking the hour. The city stretches. A bus hisses to a stop at a corner, its doors folding open to admit an early shift worker. The smell of coffee begins to drift from the diners, mixing with the clean scent of the cold river air. The great, grinding machine of New York is beginning to turn again, not for war, but for the simple, complex business of living. The long night of the early 40s is finally, officially over. The sun is up. We have walked from the hissing radiator of a cold dusk to the bright silence of a new dawn. We have stood in the neon canyon and felt the weight of a world exhaling. This was the moment the lights returned, not just to the streets, but to the spirit of the city. If this quiet journey through the past has brought you a moment of rest, consider subscribing for more histories found in the stillness. The war is over. The city sleeps. And so we hope, can you.